What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Elliot Ackerman. How are you, Elliot?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, not too bad, man. You're looking pretty cozy. Where are you right now? What's life going on like for you at the moment? You've lived a crazy life so far. How does this measure up?
Um, I'm in New York City, where I live half the time.
Uh,
So, in my apartment. Yeah,
yeah.
that's where I'm talking to you from.
I mean, is it kind of just dead there at this point? I grew up in North Jersey, and I went to school in New York. I go back twice a year. What's it like right now? What's the vibe? I mean, you hear so many different horror
No,
stories.
it's not. It's not dead.
Yeah.
Um, the you know you have these sidewalk cafes everywhere now, which I actually really like. So,
Uh,
and hopefully they will stick around
yeah.
after COVID. So it sort of feels like you're kind of in your, a little bit more European now.
Yeah.
But the weather is like getting cold and people are like very stubbornly sticking to the sidewalk cafes. So I think today I was walking around and like, people are out there with their puffy jackets and, beanies and eating their hamburger or their spaghetti or whatever. So they don't, they just don't want to have to be holed up in their apartments.
It's gnarly. I mean, San Francisco's kind of like 55 degrees all the time, anyways.
Yeah.
So we're used to that. But yeah, there's a place across the street from me. They have a whole setup, sidewalk, heat lamps, the whole thing. But they're doing business and it's good.
Yeah.
I own a dog walking business. That's how I pay my rent in San Francisco. And that's how it allowed me to be a writer. But I'm super stoked to talk to you. You're the first author that I've had a chance to talk to who I feel like actually writes about things that they know. For people who don't know, Elliot's smiling. For people who don't know, you served 8 years in the Marine Corps, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I'm gonna, we can talk about how you got there, but I'm super interested in. Were you writing before you got into the Marines? Was it something you started to do while you were in the Marines? Is there any combination? Because that's what you write about.
Yeah. The My mother is a writer, so I grew up around writers, so it didn't seem like the totally weirdest thing to go do.
Mhm.
And then I studied history and literature in college, and then I went to the Marines. And while I was in the Marines, I was not writing. I've always been a reader,
Yeah.
I've always, I guess, like worked with words, but I wasn't like writing fiction or anything like that. And then when, but I always sort of suspected I might write. And then when it got time to leave the Marines, I was going to go do whatever was next for me in life. That was when I kind of decided I wanted to try my hand at writing, and started making like my first what I would call serious efforts at writing.
What were you reading before you started writing?
Oh, geez, everything.
Uh,
I mean, I've always read, and I think I'm not the first person to say this, but writing and reading go hand in hand.
with
I
that,
mean,
some people say the opposite, but I agree.
well, I mean, you have to write or be a writer. You have to read. You're always reading. I'd say I spend as much time, if not more time, probably more time reading than I do writing. And so that's just always been part of my life.
Are you the kind of guy, I was in the Marine Corps, but I'd like to impose discipline within my own life, self-taught discipline. Are you the kind of guy who you wake up every day, do you read at the same time, do you write at the same time? Are you a routine kind of guy? Or how do you go about, spending time reading, spending time writing? How do you?
Yeah. Um, Listen, I'm very regimented in how I work, and I like the regimentation. But there are many ways one can be a writer. So I myself, I have kind of like, hey, if I'm not working on a project, this is how many words I'm going to do today. This is where the project's going. If I'm editing, this is how many pages I'm editing today, and I kind of make short-term and long-term goals for myself, and that keeps me. It keeps me sane, and and when I'm kind of in the groove of that, it actually makes me happy. It gives me a lot of satisfaction, because I feel like I'm, slowly summiting up this mountain. But my wife is a writer, as
Okay.
well, and she sort of works very differently. She will be thinking about something for a long time, and I'll see her days, and each one of her days will be a little different, and it will look as though she is not necessarily working on her book or working on. She also writes for film, so working on a screenplay.
Uh,
But But then all of a sudden I'll say, what's going on? How's your work going? She's like, oh, like, I wrote, 8,000 words the last 2 days or whatever, and what I realized is she is working it out in her head.
Mhm.
And then once it's like completely, she's got a head full of steam, it's about to go, then she kind of just sits down at the computer and lays it all out on the computer, which she's already figured out in her head. Whereas I have to sit there and kind of just really grind it out and extricate it from myself each day. So, I think there's no one way to go about it, but if you were to like categorize me as a species of writer, I would say I am of the species of, grind it out.
Most definitely. And that's not to say that when you're not sitting down at the computer or whatever it is when you're writing, that you're not also working on the book in your head as well, right? I mean, when you're deep in a project, you're living with it. I mean, even subconsciously.
Yeah, you are, but I actually have a discipline I also enforce on myself is I don't and really try not to have myself be thinking about a book when I'm not working on it.
Okay.
I've found you can also write out your work in your head, and then you go down and you try to do it the next day, and you can't do it as well.
Hmm.
Like I will, when I finish my work day each day, I like put the project into my subconscious, like as a separate room, and I shut the door on it, and I like let it kind of just mature there. And then I read and I think about other things, and I live my life, and I deal with my kids, and I walk my dog, and whatever else I'm doing. Um, but then, another thing for me is I read a lot of journalism too, and the journalism also helps with my writing, like kind of going between the two modes.
So,
Fiction.
I'm going to try to paint a picture, and if it's totally off base, let me know.
Mhm.
You're serving the Marines in the Middle East at this time when you started in the
Yeah.
Middle East, right? You were part of the immediacy of after 9/11. You're part of all that, right? Are you in the Middle East? Are you thinking about that first kind of story at all? Are there any notions whatsoever? It was literally once you were done, it was kind of like, let's just do this next move and bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah, I wasn't sitting there, like in Iraq or in Afghanistan being like, oh yeah, this is going to be a great scene in my
There are
novel.
some authors who have done that, right? There are some.
I was not thinking that. I
Uh,
kind of had this suspicion like, someday I might write, who knows, maybe I'll write something about this. Who knows? There were books about uh, war that I had read that had been very important to me, that I'd read before I went to war, and some of them that I reread after I'd gone to war for the first time and had derived different meanings from them. There's a part of me that felt like, hey, these like writers like, Jim Webb, who wrote Fields of Fire, who was a Marine, or, obviously like guys like Tim O'Brien. And I felt, that the Vietnam generation of writers, they were kind of the custodians of the memory of that war. And so there was this part of me that kind of felt like, oh, maybe I'll try to do something like that. But it was always pretty abstract. And then as I was, I tried once or twice to see just if I could write. I mean, almost like a journal entry.
yeah,
Well, it always felt like I get too sensitive. Like, I don't want to do this. This doesn't
yeah.
feel right. And it was actually when I was in Afghanistan on what would become my last deployment. I made the decision that I was going to resign, and like this was it for me. And my son Hokie said it was literally like the next day I started writing what felt to me like my first serious attempts. And it was almost though I needed the psychic closure of knowing that chapter was over for me before I could start to embark seriously on a new chapter, writing. And that sort of was how things proceeded for me.
So I mean, did you kind of come at it I mean, I came into writing in an ass backward way. I was touring in bands forever, and then I
Mhm,
moved to San Francisco. And then once that kind of stopped happening, I realized, well, I have this wealth of knowledge. I can write about this. I
mhm.
ended up writing a boxing novella first, but now I'm working on a rock and roll book, right? Um, I have never taken a creative writing class in my life. Have you?
Neither have I.
Okay, it seems to be this is for people listening to the podcast. It seems to be a running theme. There's a lot of authors out there who have never once taken creative writing class. Do you look back? I mean, do you think you wish you would have taken any of that stuff? Would it have kind of fucked up what you were doing now?
I have a number of friends who are writers too, and a number of whom are graduates of like very fine MFA programs, and we'll talk about it sometimes. And it's tough to know what you've not experienced, but kind of the consensus among them when I'm like, how did this MFA help you? I'm like, asking like, is like, there's some class you took with someone that like blew your mind. And most of them, kind of what they will say is like, what the MFA gave them and the writing degree gave them was one, the time to write. So like the ability, because most of the best programs were, are fully funded. So it's like I had 2 years and I could just write, and I needed that time. And a community of other writers, just, a hand, 2, 3, 4, however many people, just people to show your work to talk to, because it's a pretty lonely endeavor. And when I look at my own career,
it's all good, no worries.
All right, hey buddy. Okay, thanks. No problem.
That's what it is. Welcome to the new podcasting realm.
Yeah, we can edit that or not. So when I talked to those writers, they were given time to write, and they were given the kind of a community of other writers. And I looked in my own. I'm sorry.
A luxury.
Yeah, a luxury. But I look back at my own development, and I'm like, okay. I'm like, time to write. Like, I got out of the Marines, and I had for a couple years, I had jobs that were, forgiving. In like, there was time on the margins. I could organize my day in a way where I made enough time for myself to write. Mm-hmm. And then I just sort of, by being out there, met the people that kind of became like my people, my community of writers, close friends of mine who are still the people I kind of kick my work around with. And so so like, kind of, it's interesting. In my own experience, I wound up basically replicating that. So yeah, that's sort of, and I think, listen, the places where I learn the most is by reading. I read other writers. Mm-hmm. It's the reading I've done over years, kind of, I feel like it's formed my sensibility, what I'm interested in, and whatever type of style that I have.
So when you were writing those first pages, were you bouncing these ideas off of anyone at that time? Were you the kind of person like, let's just get this first draft on the paper and then worry about it? Can you think back to that first book?
Yeah. So I in short order started writing a novel that was sort of like a pretty autobiographical novel about like my time in the war and themes, that I had taken away from those experiences. And I did that totally quietly, not telling anybody that I was doing it.
Okay.
Because it sort of felt silly to me. It felt like to say like I want to be a writer. It felt like saying like, I want to dance.
Hey, what it is though, someone has to dance.
I hadn't published anything.
Yeah.
I just wanted. I didn't know if I could do it. And I was like, just I don't know. Sort of, I was like, hey, you need to shut your mouth and see if you can even do this.
Yeah.
Before you're walking around telling everybody that you're doing it.
Yeah.
So I very quietly kind of worked on this for a while, and then and I had a couple people read it. I trusted. And then I was very fortunate in that I found an agent in really short order. And at first it was like, wow, like this is actually going great. Like,
were you submitting it to agents, or was it kind of just happenstance that you met them?
No, I had a sort of a distant, like a family friend who I kind of had met sort of professionally, who had worked in publishing for a long time.
Oh, okay.
He's sort of an older, cantankerous guy, but he basically said to me like, Elliot, you were in the war, and so I feel like I have to read your book, so I'm going to read your book. And then he called me and said, hey, and I quote, I called you, Elliot, I read your book, and you know what? I don't think it's a piece of shit. So I'm going to give it to one other person, and I'm going to see if they like it. And this was an old editor who he worked with professionally. That editor liked it. That editor passed it on to an agent. And then, one of them, I had, an agent who's still my agent.
Great.
This day. And who's just, he's fantastic. And that agent was like, all right, Elliot, great. I love this. We're going to go out. Here's a list of the editors I want to give it to. And I kind of, I didn't really know, but I was like, yeah, wow, this sounds great. And this looks good to me. And we went out with the book, went out big with the book. And then, 1 week passed, 2 weeks passed, 6 weeks passed, and I had a list of rejection letters, and everyone had rejected the book. And so I sort of had that experience. I was like, wow. And I had started working on what was my second book.
While
Uh,
you were trying to get that first book off the ground.
yeah, I was like, okay, I finished this book. What do I do now? I want to
Yeah.
keep writing. I have an idea for a second book. Well, like, what else can you do? Might as well start working on it.
Did you have that idea for the second book already in your head?
Yeah, I kind of had a sense of what it was going to
Uh,
be. I was like, all right, I'm gonna work on this. And so I started working on it. As soon as we sit there, we got a mess of rejection letters. I still stand by it, but I think it was a good book. There were some marketing things. There was a very similar book that was about to come out that a publisher had paid a whole bunch of money for.
uh-huh.
And it was interesting at this point in publishing, actually, there wasn't a single book-length work of fiction by a veteran about the wars that a major publisher had published yet.
This is like mid 2000s.
It's 2012.
Oh, I'm sorry, 2012. Yeah.
There've been a ton of memoirs. There've been a ton of nonfiction books, like heaps of them, but actually no major publisher had published a work of fiction by a veteran at that point.
Interesting.
And so one publisher had made this major play on one book. It kind of everyone was waiting to like prove the marketplace. And like many of the rejections that novel got were like, hey, we just don't like this book. But there were enough, and they're like, hey, we like it, but we don't know if this other book's going to work. We don't know if this is going to work, so not for us. Anyway, but I bring it up for anyone who's listening. That like it stings. Rejection stings. Like this was that. It was like this very close to the bone book about my war experiences. And God loving my agent was like, hey, I'm still up to working with you. Like we got some feedback on your first book, Elliot. Like I don't maybe see if you want to try to move some things around, re-edit it. Maybe we can, you'll have another chance to, these editors might give it a second look. And he said, you're working on this other book. So like, why don't you finish that? And so about 9 months passed and I did all that work and I finished the other book and I revised the first book. I handed both of them to my agent. He read them and said, listen, I like the second book. It's fresh. Let's go out with that. Without boring you with too many details, we managed to sell it in pretty short order, and kind of the rest is history. And that second book is Green on Blue, which was my first novel, my first novel. But my first novel was actually my second novel. And I look back at that experience, and actually I really value it now. Because I like to say that you're not a real writer until two things have happened to you. The first is that you've done a reading that like 4 people have shown up to.
I've done that.
everyone has. There's 2 types of writers: the ones that will admit it and the ones that won't.
Oh, yeah.
And the second is that you've written a book that nobody's bought. And once you've had those 2 experiences, you're kind of bulletproof. Because every time you sit down to start a new project, like I got an idea, I think it might be a book, I don't know. And you're like, well, do I want to start? It's so much time. It's like, in my mind, I'm always like, hey, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, huh? You're going to write your book. No one's going to fucking buy it. Like, bullshit. You've already been through that. You're fine. And I go. And so it actually has, at a very early point in my career, I had that experience, and having it now, it helps me. It helps me approach my work with less fear, and that fear can be a huge creative inhibitor. And so I don't have that fear.
And so you said that first book you were writing went on to become the second book.
The first book I was writing has never been published.
Oh, so no. Okay. Yeah. Again, another running theme on the podcast.
It's sitting on my laptop. Maybe someday. Like I said, I still think it's a good book. Yeah. I did my second, and I had ideas for what I want the next one to be, and similar books to that first book. Like I said, it was sort of a quasi autobiographical war novel. There's been a bunch of those, and I don't feel at this point in my career I want to go publish one of those.
Oh, definitely.
So it's just sort of sitting there. So it'll be, maybe someday it'll be like a B-side track.
Well, it's also, but you could also look at it as an education in writing, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an education in the creative process, and that you're going to
creative process.
Yeah, or any, for me, for my creative process, but you're going to get kicked. You're going to get kicked around. It's going to happen, and the difference is that the people who stick it out.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it, ad nauseum at this point, but I was rejected by 73 agents for the book that I tried to get, and then I ended up self-publishing it, which I'm happy I did. It's a novella, but at the same time, to have talking to more and more authors about these first books just sitting on laptops, never seeing the fucking light of day, being thrown in a volcano, giving it to the dog to eat, all these things. It's important for people to hear that. Every day when I'm working, it's when you get stuck on these things and having the discipline to push forward, know that what you were saying before, like what's the worst that's going to happen? I've already eaten shit. What else can I do? You just
Yeah, I think it's important. I think writers often have a tendency to kind of hide their failures and not want to talk about them and feel like it in some way means they are a failure. And I think that's facts. I think that's how we don't support each other, artistically. Like it's rough out there. It's rough out there for everybody, but you got to keep going. And I think you have to have not only the discipline to sit at the desk and do your work, but you also have to have the mental discipline to separate the business and publishing side of your life and the creative side of your life. And sometimes they're going to be perfectly aligned and sometimes they're not. And that's okay. There isn't anyone who has walked this road, who hasn't had that experience of them not aligning the way that you want.
Yeah.
But the people, you're not going to make it if here's something no one should do is like write your book, finish it, send it out and say, I'm never going to write a thing until this book comes out and is a huge bestseller. I'm not going to, you'll never make it. You got to keep going. You just got to keep going.
And when you started writing this, again, you're writing about something you know intimately well. I know, are you aware of Jack Carr? Do you know the author Jack Carr?
No.
Oh, okay. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he's a dude. He's very specific in his writing. He's talking about the gun, the exact model of the sniper being used, the scope and things like that, the bullet grade, all that kind of stuff. Was that something you were trying to do in your own writing? Are you super into specifics and things like that? Because we're working in fiction, right? So you can create any world you want. You can do anything you want.
Yeah,
having that wealth of knowledge, obviously, you can work.
Yeah, nothing against him. I don't think any of that stuff is interesting. Like there's a great Faulkner quote. He says the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. Like that's what interests me, and I think I've written about that in war. I've written about that in the theme of marriage, the theme of divorce, raising children. Like those are the things that really interest me. Is these these paradigms where you kind of have characters who are irreconcilable with one another and are in situations that are irreconcilable, and then how they behave. That's what interests me. So listen, if I have if I have to have expertise to to give a situation, it's for it to feel true and to feel honest. Yes, of course you have to have that expertise. Like my most recent book, Red Dress in Black and White, all takes place in Istanbul, and I lived in Istanbul for about 3 years. And so when I'm writing about,
I've been there one time.
Okay, when I'm writing about the streets and the way that I obviously have to describe that very accurately. But that level of detail is not truly what the book is about. The book is about, I hope, themes that are more universal and themes that people will identify with. Whether or not they've ever been to that city, and at one times when I've written about war, whether or not they've ever been to war. So I hope that it kind of that the books transcend the specific and start to take on the sense of the universal.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I think the specifics can be nauseating at times. When you want the story to kind of just keep going and you're getting stuck on these small little details. You ever read any Saul Bellow?
Yeah, I definitely read some Saul
Bellow. I'm reading Herzog.
Yeah.
And at times, again, we're talking about details. He's writing about Chicago, he's writing about New York, and at times the details become so, maybe because I know those cities so well, I personally don't need all those details. But I agree with you. It can be nauseating at times. I'm not the biggest fan of it either. I figured though, maybe,
what are they serving? What are the details serving? How do they serve the story? And everyone has their own style. You know what I mean? So, I'm not against details. Sometimes when you talk about, what gives a person, in war, I would say what gives a person the real, like the type of authority if someone's writing about war where I'm like, wow, I'm really impressed. Like that person knows their stuff.
Mhm.
It's not that they're going to be able to explain to me exactly how to like adjust the windage on a, on a Remington sniper rifle. Like
Yeah, 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 yeah,
that's, to me, that's not what is impressive.
yeah.
What was impressive to me is that they kind of understand at a more profound level some of the really like just nuanced variables that exist, within war. The way, it can be like magnificent and terrifying, and like some of the, I would say, the conflicting paradigms that exist around, heroism and cowardice, and like, things like, Tim O'Brien, when he writes that like going to Vietnam was a choice of cowardice on my part, like, just stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, wow, like that's profound.
Mhm.
You know, he gets it. I understand what he's saying. So, so to me, like those are the details. And I'm using war as an example, but with any subject where I'm like, wow, like, that I've never thought about it that way, and that, wow, that really makes a lot of sense. And that's what in the books I read, that's what I enjoy in those books, is when
Um,
something really makes me look at a subject in a new way.
yeah, as a New York author, I'm looking at my bookshelf. Another New York author, his newest book kind of gets into this. Do you ever read any Colin McCann?
A little bit, yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah,
It's
he
a good
wrote a
book.
brand. I'm gonna butcher the name. I keep forgetting. Apparagon. It's his brand new novel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I know, I'm familiar. I haven't read it, but I'm
Oh,
familiar.
I'm a big fan, but it's taking place between two characters. One's an Israeli, one is a Palestinian, and
Right.
so he puts you in that world. He puts you in that city. He puts you in those places. But at the same time, he's also creating a story, people coming together, unity, and things like that.
Felt very natural to do journalism. And I write a column for a couple of outlets. I one I do at the New York Times, and one I do often for Time Magazine.
mm,
And to me, oftentimes, kind of like the journalism is a first draft of my fiction. So like issues and themes I'm wrestling with in my fiction will often come out in a piece of journalism, because something will happen. I'll see something, I'll experience something. I'm like, oh, I kind of, I want to, I'm going to write about this. I'm like, oh, I'm going to write it in a column for, 1,000 words, 1,500 words. And then the ideas, as I kind of am able to express them in a column, will start to manifest into a work of fiction. So like, like for instance, my second novel is a book called Dark at the Crossing, which all takes place around the Turkish-Syrian border during the Syrian civil war. That book was published in 2017. And then in 2019, I published a memoir called Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. And if you were to read those two books in tandem, you can see there's lots of overlap.
uh,
Uh, and one might think like, oh, Places and Names was published later. It's like, no, actually, the pieces that are in Places and Names, I wrote those bits of journalism first, and then sort of some of the themes in those pieces of journalism found their way into Dark at the Crossing.
do you approach writing fiction and writing journalistic pieces the same, or do you kind of, again, it's a shorter piece?
Um, I'd say there's a lot of overlap in how the pieces work. There are different constraints. I mean, obviously, a piece of journalism, like, it has to be true. These
Yeah,
things have to have happened. I can start making shit up,
yeah.
but
Some
uh,
people do.
some people, but it's not a good practice or a good habit. But that being said, I can really pick in a piece of nonfiction, like, what am I going to like take my camera and like focus in on with, a lot of, okay, this is the image I'm going to leave you with, and like, what's going to be the architecture of this piece. And so, so at the end of the day, I feel like when I'm like constructing a scene in a piece of journalism versus constructing a scene in a novel, as long as I've got all like the raw material, like I'm kind of constructing it oftentimes in the same way, and trying to achieve many of the same effects with the reader.
And again, are you doing it at the same time? Are you writing at the same time every day when you're doing a journalistic piece, or is it kind of just you got to get it out?
Usually, I wake up, I work out, I like sit down at my desk, I make myself a little breakfast, and I'm sitting there for 4 or 5 hours
What
working,
kind of working out are you doing?
like running, or I lift weights, or stuff
Well,
like
I mean,
that.
I again,
I do
one
10,000.
of my
Jacks.
Well, I mean, one of the things I wish if I can go back in time and do it all over again, I would have joined probably try to
Mhm.
attempt to join the Marine Corps at some point in a different universe, right? So now older, I'm trying to discipline myself in different ways. But yeah, no. Do you find extra? I mean, when I'm getting stuck creatively, I'll go for a run. I exercise. It's the best for me.
I will say when I think back to like moments when I've been working on a project, and I'm
Yeah.
kind of like, thinking, like in the morning, I should like to think about it because I'm getting ready to work. So I will start really thinking about it, what I'm going to work on that day. I will say, 70% of my breakthroughs on projects have happened while I've been
Oh
exercising,
yeah.
and the other 30% in the shower.
Uh-huh. Are you a dude? Do you write on the phone? Are you a voice memo kind of guy?
Sometimes, yeah, if I need to be, if
Uh,
something comes to me, I'll just give myself a voice memo.
uh,
Um, yeah, so I've definitely done that.
I
So,
feel I feel like
and
I've.
and frankly, a lot of ideas will come to me while I'm reading.
Oh,
Like
okay.
I'll be reading something, and then an idea will pop, and I'm like, oh my god, of course, and I'll write it in the margins of the book.
You ever find yourself when you're reading certain authors and something like that happens, do you start to write like certain authors at times? If you're deep into
Yeah, not maybe a little more before, not so much anymore. But I feel like there's just there's just a little, now it's like kind of it's like a palimpsest. It's been like I've been written over so many times by so many authors with the ones that I've read. Um, so not as much, but I'll definitely like see something from that an author does that I admire, and realize, or structurally a lot of times I'll see something an author does, like, oh, that's smart, or structurally that could help me. So
Mhm.
so I'm definitely influenced. That's why I read. I mean, I'm influenced by other authors, and that can often help me. Um, and frankly, and just sometimes just like reading a great book will help you in your own work, just because you're really enjoying a piece of fiction. So.
I mean, I don't know if you're into music, but I mean, even a great album. I mean, if I put on a Paul Simon record, I
Mm-hmm.
can get turned on by the lyrics, and
Yeah.
him singing about New York City is enough to kind of just blow, at least inspire me to want to sit down, because sitting down and writing can be a laborious, awful fucking task. And
You,
it's
you can it can be tough to feel like the enjoyment in it,
yeah,
and I think when you feel the enjoyment in it, you usually do it better. At least I know I do.
yeah,
So.
because you had said earlier in the podcast, you find enjoyment out of it. Are you conscious and you're cognizant of the fact of when you're in the writing itself, you're finding joy, or is it when looking back, you're
Well,
like,
I often find no joy in it, or
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, yeah.
I will often listen. The times I find the greatest joy is when I've been working on something for a while. That's why I do this, and I'll start to see how it all connects. Like I've said before, like I find my writing process is kind of like, all right, I'm going to sit at my table, and I sit down at the table, and I've got like a big sack. Imagine I've got this big sack next to me, and in that sack are a bunch of like jigsaw puzzle pieces, and I can't see in the sack. So I reach my hand in, go in here, and I'm like, all right, here,
Boom.
okay, this is the piece. This piece has a curve, and I start describing the piece in detail, how it looks, what it feels like. Then I'm like, that's the piece. I put it on the table. I do another piece, and I'll kind of have an idea of these pieces and maybe what they, but I don't really know. I'm just describing pieces. I'm describing pieces, and sometimes I'll get like 90, 120 pages into something, and I will just have a bunch of goddamn pieces that don't really fit together, and I will give up on a project, and I've done that before. Um, but then sometimes I'll start to see how they all fit together, and then they'll all like a puzzle, and they'll all start fitting together really quickly. I'm like, oh my god, like, oh yeah, like, and like I take great joy in that when I really start seeing, how something fits together. Um, and when that happens, often it's like I'll be like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the project, and I'll kind of see and then I'll see like all the way to the end. Like it's like I'm standing on the mountain, and I can see like all the way out to the sea, and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. This is
Well,
great.
that was the question. I asked a lot of people this too. When you start a book or start a new thing, do you know the end?
No,
You
not
never
really.
know the end.
Not really.
So it's just every day is something new. And I'm the same way. Some authors I've talked to, they know the first sentence and the last sentence, and then they just got to fill the shit in between. You don't know at the.
No, I've, no, I very rarely, I'll have a sense of what I think the book is about thematically and
Mm,
how it begins, and maybe generally where I think it's going. But I don't know exactly how it ends. And then usually at some point I will figure out like, oh, this is how it ends.
Mhm.
Then I start filling in everything in between.
Mhm.
So, but again, the figuring out is kind of where I get the most joy.
A lot of drafts.
I mean, there's always lots of drafts. But something I do, your listeners are interested. So like I will write my first draft and to really get in the mechanics. So I do about 1,000 words when I'm on a project Monday to Friday. The weekend, I read over what I did the week before. I always, at the beginning of each day, I always read what I did the day before.
Mhm.
And then I get to the end of the day and I never stop when I don't know what's going to happen. So I hit my 1,000 words, but I always know what's going to happen. I usually write the first sentence for the next day, like in all caps. Like
Yeah,
that's
kind of get yourself going. I do the same
yeah.
thing. Yeah.
I've got the next first sentence, and then I've got some bullet proofs. This is what happens at the and usually as the draft gets longer, like my notes at the end and are 10 pages of notes at the end that I'm kind of sifting through to make sure I'm going in the right direction. And then I get to the end of that draft, and I will have been kind of reading over each weekend. Like I read 50 pages back each weekend. So I'm always reading back, reading it over. Not editing though, in any profound sense.
Mhm.
I write the whole thing out, and then I get to the end, and I go back, and my second draft is usually I just put up the first draft and I retype the entire first draft.
Oh wow. Why? Why?
It's a way, it's a way of editing,
Okay.
So when you edit and you're editing on a draft that's already written, it's a process of elimination.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's to remove something is actually it's easier to keep something in than to take it out. To take it out, you have to go in there, you have to rechange to pull it out, right? Whereas if I'm retyping the whole thing, it's actually the affirmative act is to include something. I have to physically include something. So I'm like, it
Mm-hmm.
better be good. Because if it's not good, then it's just easier. If I don't have to retype, this is dumb. That's easy for me. So it actually makes it easier to get rid of the
Yeah.
shit that's no
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
If I'm typing, I'm like, this is good enough for me to be re-including into this draft.
And
And I just
are you trusting your gut as you're doing this?
add my taste, and my taste. It's just my taste in the story, and this is what I think is good. So that's sort of what I've almost now all do with all my books. I retype the entire first draft, saying I've retyped the whole thing as a way of editing, and I'm editing as I go. I'm like, oh, that was dumb. What was I thinking? That doesn't sound right. No, that paragraph gone. But whereas if it was like I was just editing, I'm like, well, that paragraph, I'm like, oh, it sounds okay. I'll leave it in. It's easy. Who cares? And I do that, kind of first to second draft, and then I've got, a better draft, and then, I'll go, usually on like my third draft, I'll print the thing out and I will read it out loud with like a pencil, again, put in all the changes, and I kind of take it, and, then maybe by that point, I'm like showing it to like one or two trusted readers and they give me their edits. But maybe it's not being a product of MFA programs. I don't circulate my stuff super widely. My wife is one of my early readers, maybe one or two other people, and then I hand it to my agent. Whereas I have friends of mine who are, like very successful writers, and most of them seem to be from it, and they send it out everywhere. And I'll tell them, like, God, I'll say to them, like, God, how can you send it out? It doesn't drive you crazy, all this feedback. I mean, and they're like, no, I know who's good at what, and I know what stuff to disregard and what stuff to include. Whereas me, I just, I don't know, I would feel too exposed doing it that way.
And you were doing that from the get-go, or did you have to kind of teach yourself or learn that process along?
Kind of by like after my first or second book, I kind of dialed in what that process was.
Yeah.
But it was a process of figuring what works for me. It's just like that's just what works for me.
Yeah. And you're a one book at a time. You're not Danielle Steele working on 7 books at once, right?
No, I'm usually like, just kind of one at a time. I mean, I'll be, there might be like a time where like I was like, if I've sold a book, and it's sitting with my editor, and she's like, yeah, we're going to edit it, but it's not slated for a year from now. I'll be working on something else while I'm waiting, however many months for the edits to come in.
You're working on anything right now?
Yeah, I have a new book that comes out in March.
Okay.
It's a work of speculative fiction. It's actually the first thing I've ever co-written, and it's a book that imagines what it would look like if the U.S. and China went to war in the year 2034.
Okay.
Called 2034.
Okay.
I've written it with a guy named Admiral Jim Stavridis, and he was the commander of NATO.
Wow.
Uh, and we've been friends for a while, and we have the same editor, and so we decided to team up for this one. And it's a fun book. It's good characters, I think. Pages turn.
What,
So,
what
so,
was the
so
co-writing process like?
it was great. I think we had the idea for the book. He was the original one who had the idea for the book and approached our editor, who's a shared editor, and our editor said, "Well, you and Elliot are friends. Like, you should work with a novelist on this,
Yeah.
and like, why don't you and Elliot team up and do it together?" And so, and we'd known one another for a long time before that, and we was like, well, so we said, "Hey, let's let's see if we can write a chapter together. Let's just like see what that's like." And we had an idea for how it opened, and we like wrote the chapter together. Like, hey, that worked okay. Like, I bet we could do this. And so we just started banging out the chapters of the book. So
I think of doubles tennis.
yeah, a little bit like that, and it's going to come out, and it was fun. It was a departure for me. Usually my books are much more interior to me, and and you're working on it all alone, and not till pretty late in the game that somebody else takes a look. Whereas this, it was constantly two sets of eyes on it. Yeah.
Was his writing kind of motivating you? Was he kind of motivating you to kind of step up your game too, working alongside with someone?
Yeah, I think Jim he's written a number of great nonfiction books, and so I think for him it was fun, working on a novel for the first time, and for me it was fun working with someone who has, served and played at the level that he's played at, as a retired 4-star admiral, who's in command of all military forces in Europe and Afghanistan. And so it's like, okay, Jim, like, what do you think happens next in this plan? And he kind of
I'll tell you what happens next.
Yeah, and he would walk it through, and then we talk about, okay, so like our primary characters, how do we think they're moving in this? And we sort of figure the chapters, and so that was a fun experience as opposed to what I'm usually doing, which is this very long, lonely walk through a novel where you get to the end, but the whole journey's by yourself.
It's nice to have someone helping you along the way. Why not?
Yeah, it's like if you're someone who typically goes and does runs by themselves early in the morning, and then one day you go run at 1 PM with a friend.
Yeah, I do. Elliot, this has been a blast. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Are you on Instagram, social media, anything like that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram.
Okay, and I always ask, what's your favorite bookstore?
Well, I'm a DC guy, so I'd have to say Politics and Prose, but I also have to give a shout out to Lemuria Books in Mississippi is a great one. There's so many really, really great ones. Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi is another great one.
Love it. Michael Ferris Smith gave a shout out to them.
Yeah, they're fantastic. And I got to say, support your local booksellers, particularly right now. It's been a rough year for the indies, so we gotta help them out.
Elliot, thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, most definitely. We'll talk again soon. Take care.